things. There's been a lot of recent developments with COVID-19. Cases are up. Mask mandates are starting to materialize again. Vaccination policies are heating up. So we thought it'd be a good time to get the lay of the land, update you all from a legal perspective. So I'm going to start on that. I'm going to talk about vaccine policies, vaccine mandates, whether it's employer or owner policy. Talk about where mask mandates are at. And then Brent Miller is going to talk about the safety, primarily the OSHA part of it. So next slide, please, Jeff. This one is probably the most important slide. That's our contact information. Brent and I are available here at the AGC office to walk you through any issues. Today is going to be, for time reasons, pretty high overview, but if you get into the details, we're available. So don't hesitate to reach out if you're running into specific issues or trying to implement some of these policies. Like I said, it's probably the most important slide because you can reach out to us. The next one's going to be the roadmap I talked about. So we're going to talk about what choices employers and owners have and what the legal ramifications might be for various vaccine policies and mandates. Then we're going to talk about where mask mandates are at and what source you should be looking at to figure out what is the mask policy wherever you happen to be at. And then we're going to look at OSHA's COVID-19 considerations. Next slide. Big question, can employers or owners require a vaccine? The general answer is yes, with some exceptions. I'm not going to go through them all. The important thing is that if you do have a mandate, and that's either because you as a company are deciding to mandate the vaccine, or it's an owner requirement, so you're imposing it on your employers or your employees because an owner is requiring that, you can require it, but you need to account for these issues here. So the two primary ones, there needs to be an accommodation made for people under the ADA. So if they have a documented medical reason for why they can't get vaccinated, there has to be a process there to see, what that medical issue is. Is there an accommodation that can be made for that person that can't get the vaccine? Can they, work at a job site that doesn't require it? Can they work by themselves? Can they mask up? Are there other things to do? That needs to be in the policy. You can't have a blanket policy that says you have to be vaccinated or you're fired. You can't do that. You have to make these accommodations, and this should be part of your policy. Religious issues similarly. Now that's not going to apply to very many people. It's going to be a very, very small minority of people that have a documented legitimate reason why they can't get vaccinated, or it's a pretty obscure religions that ban vaccines, but they're out there, and you do need to accommodate for it. And to the extent that worker is part of a union, there can be issues there because workplace rules, safety rules are a mandatory topic of collective bargaining. So that's been an issue. That's something we've reached out to the unions, getting their view on it, but that's another, to the extent that workers unionized, you need to be careful and make sure that you're not running afoul of CBA rules by requiring a vaccine. You also need to be aware of state-specific laws. So there are bills in some states that are saying you can't require a vaccine. The state can do that. Wisconsin, that's not the case. I don't think we're going to see that the case because we're divided government. I just don't see the Governor Evers signing off on a law that says you can't require a vaccine. I could be wrong, but that doesn't mean that's not going to be the case in other states. I'm not aware of any states that have passed that, but they're certainly in the works. And as things materialize over the next couple of weeks, next couple of months, it wouldn't surprise me if some states say you can't mandate a vaccine. So if you're in Wisconsin, I don't think we're going to end up with that. We don't have it now, but if you're working in certain other states, that might be an issue. So that's something to keep an eye on. And then finally, it's not a legal consideration, but you can pretty much count on some employee pushback. There's been surveys done. The construction industry is the most vaccine hesitant workforce of any industry. I would guess probably about 40% of people in the construction industry, it'll change company by company, but 40% are vaccinated, 60% aren't. Some of that 60%, if it's a job requirement, will get it. Some of that 60%, if it's right in front of them and they don't have to take 5 minutes to go to Walgreens, they might get it, but there's going to be some percent of your workforce that will they'd rather get a different job than get vaccinated. So count on that. That's going to be part of it. And it's worth thinking about, what are you going to do with that? If you say get a vaccine or you're fired, are you going to stand by that if a quarter of your workforce is in that boat? Or can you plan around it? Maybe you've got one owner that requires it, but you got a different job site where you can put non-vaccinated people. That's something you're entitled to do. You can treat employees differently based on their vaccination status. So if you got a few job sites and only one requires vaccinations because of the owner, you can send vaccinated people there and non-vaccinated people to the other job sites. So it's worth thinking about, knowing that you're going to get some employee pushback. How are you going to deal with it? Next slide. This, I think, is probably, I'm not aware, I don't think many contractors are going to require it across the board no matter what. I think there's some, you're certainly entitled to do that, but I think most contractors are not going to require it as a condition of working for that company. But it's popping up where owners are requiring it, and then you gotta figure out how you're going to deal with that. So I think this is probably where most contractors will fall. They're not going to have their own blanket policy, but owner by owner, they're going to run into owners that are requiring it, whether it's state jobs, federal jobs, or certain private owners, I think, are going to start requiring it. We're already seeing it, and I think that's just going to ramp up. So it's probably something that a lot of contractors, to the extent they're not already facing it, are going to start facing. So what do you do if you get an owner mandate that they only want vaccinated people on their job site? First, you got to make sure that's legal. That gets back to the last slide. There needs to be an accommodation policy. If an owner's policy is vaccinated or you can't be on our property, and you enforce that on your employees without accommodations, you can be on the hook too. So if an owner's policy does not follow the law and you impose it on your employees, you can't say, well, the owner made me, there was nothing I could do. You're just as responsible for it as the employer as the owner is. So make sure it's legal. And the main thing you're gonna look for there are those accommodations. If it's not, if you get a policy from an owner that says they have to be vaccinated, it's worth reaching out to them and explaining these ADA sort of civil rights requirements, that there needs to be an accommodation piece to it. I think practically it's a very small minority of people that's going to apply to, but you still want that policy there, or it's going to stick up as a red flag to plaintiffs' attorneys, to be candid with you. Second one is you want it in writing. That allows you to avoid the he said, she said of whether there was an accommodation policy, this sort of thing. So ask for it in writing. If it's imposed after you bid or after you sign the contract, that's a new condition, and it probably opens the door for you to either get out of the contract or seek accommodation. So the two spots that it's going to probably have the most effect would be your schedule, if you're only able to use half as many workers as you planned, or there might be a cost part to it, or as I mentioned at the beginning, it might be such that you have a workforce that's you just can't do it anymore because you don't have enough people that are willing to get vaccinated to do the work. So if it's after you bid or sign the contract, have those discussions with the owner. You can educate them that regardless of it's the merit of it, that the reality is you're probably dealing with a workforce that's very vaccine hesitant, and you can tell them, you can incentivize them all you want. You can tell them either get vaccinated or you're fired, but there's going to be a pretty solid percent of people in construction that just aren't going to do it or are going to get a new job. And I think it's worth talking to owners about that, because it's one of those things that can be easy if you're sitting in a conference room somewhere for a company to mandate vaccines. But then when they find out that something that might take a month is going to take 3 months, or some of these cost issues, it's worth having that conversation. So especially if you've signed that contract and you built in that there isn't going to be a vaccine mandate, and then once put on you, get out in front of that, seek schedule adjustments and other modifications to your contract. Communicate with the owner, like I talked about that, explain to them, this is going to affect our schedule in so and so way, it might affect our ability to do the work. Get out in front of it before it happens, because like I mentioned a couple of times, X% of your workforce is just going to flat out refuse, and that's going to affect things. So similar to employers, owners have every right to require a vaccine, but that doesn't mean you're immune from the consequences of what that means, when you're trying to do construction work. Next slide. Important part of this, whether you are coming up with a policy in your company, whether it's to encourage vaccines but not require them, whether you want to require it of everybody, whether you're going to require it on a case-by-case basis as required by an owner, it should be written down. Very important. First, I would recommend talking to a professional, whether it's myself or someone that knows what they're doing with HR or the law, because this is ADA issues, civil rights issues. Common sense gets you a lot of the way there, but doesn't get you all the way there. So you really want to be careful as you're developing your policy. If you want to look at some policies, I have a link there from the Fisher Phillips law firm. They are an excellent resource. They have been since day one. And you can look at model policies for employers. They're available at that link. I think we could probably email it out afterwards, but they have all sorts of policies. I want to encourage, but I don't want to require. I want to require. How do I verify that whether or not my employees are vaccinated? Documentation, all those sorts of things are available through the Fisher Phillips law firm. So I really encourage you, to the extent you want to see some of these documents, check them out, because that's, to be candid with you, it's been a great resource for me. And they're an AGC of America member. And I will plug, they are doing a webinar through the AGC of America next Thursday at 1 p.m. about how to boost vaccination rates. So they're going to cover a little bit of what we're covering today, but they're also going to talk about practical ways to, get at some of those people that are hesitant, but, with the right poking and prodding, will get vaccinated. So they're going to go through some of those techniques. I highly encourage them, because they've really been on top of it since day one with COVID-19 issues. What that written policy has to have is, what are your expectations as far as people being vaccinated? What's your rationale? And I know I've harped on this a bunch of times, but it's just because I've dealt with litigation enough to see how it spirals out of control. You really need to have that accommodation route for people that can't get vaccinated for medical reasons or religious beliefs. You need to have that in your policy. And it should also have, are you going to implement this? Are you going to give people paid time off? Are you going to bring in nurses and just do it at the job site or do it at your office? Are you going to give people a Gander Mountain gift card? There's all sorts of permutations on what you can do as far as carrots and sticks to get people vaccinated, and that should all be in your policy. And then finally at the end there is, how do you go about asking about vaccination status? Some owners, I think, would be fine if the contractor simply signed something saying, we've verified that everyone that's going to be on the job site your job site is vaccinated. Leave it like that. Some owners are going to want to have copies of the vaccination cards. Some are going to want confirmation that you looked at the vaccination card, but they don't need to see it themselves. So that's something that, for me to cover all those issues, we'd be here about 3 hours. But you need to be very careful with that too. I think we've all been trained enough to be aware that having someone's medical records as an employer is a very touchy subject. So you want to make sure you're handling that the correct way. So even if you are mandating vaccines, either as a company or because a certain owner is requiring it, you need to make sure that you are dealing with any of that documentation the right way. And that's one where definitely makes sense to reach out to a professional. Next slide. I just want to cover mask mandates and where do they come from? The first important piece of this, CDC guidelines have moved around a little bit. In the last several weeks, they went back to saying, regardless of whether you're vaccinated or not, you should be wearing masks when you're out in public. When the CDC says something, it's not the law. It's just a recommendation. You're not going to be cited for it. The CDC doesn't have its own police enforcement force. It's just a guideline. It's not the law when the CDC does something. One question I've got is, let's say, okay, perfect example. The CDC for several weeks has said that everyone indoors, no matter where you're at, should be wearing a mask. The number of employers following that strictly in Wisconsin, I could probably count on one hand. There's just not very many people wearing masks as a policy. So one question is, if someone gets COVID, they were following the law because the law didn't require masks, but you didn't require masks, even though it was the CDC guidelines. Someone gets sick and then has some harsh ramifications. Can they come after you in Wisconsin? My answer is no. There's very little exposure there in Wisconsin specifically, because the law in Wisconsin is you are immune from COVID-19 related liability unless your conduct is reckless or is in reckless disregard of the way you should be acting. And if you're following the law and you're doing what basically every other employer is doing, you're probably not reckless. There's also a causation issue where if someone gets COVID, they would have to show that they got it at their employer, which essentially would mean they go home, they're around nobody, and they come to work, and that's all they do. Because with a disease like this, you could catch it anywhere. So someone's gonna have a really, really difficult time showing that they picked it up at work. So the CDC guidelines, you're certainly free to follow them, but it's not a requirement. It's not the law. That's very different than state, county, and municipal orders, which are the law. So often what you'll see is CDC guidelines come down the chute. Those aren't the law, but they're informing the entities that can make the law. So Dane County, for example, as of about 9 hours ago, we have a mask mandate again. I believe Milwaukee, perhaps Brown County have orders. Those are enforceable. So look for county orders, look for municipal orders. It's not going to happen in Wisconsin, but other states might have statewide orders. Those are the law. And oftentimes the CDC will make a guideline, and then you'll see people with the authority to make the law follow those guidelines in the following weeks. As we're used to by now, unfortunately, is you kind of have this web of mask mandates. As I mentioned, we're not going to have a statewide one in Wisconsin anymore. The Supreme Court ruled that Governor Evers overstepped his bounds by making a statewide order. So I don't think we're going to see that in Wisconsin, because I don't think the legislature is going to vote for it. That could change if things get dramatically worse, but I guess I would be surprised if that happens. But nothing is stopping Dane County, Brown County, Columbia County, or individual municipalities from putting in their own order. So keep an eye on that wherever you're working, whether it's in Wisconsin, outside of Wisconsin. Those county and municipal orders, that's where the law comes from, not CDC guidelines, but from those entities. So keep an eye on that. And as we know, those are constantly changing, so that requires monitoring. If you have questions, I'm certainly available, but that's something that I think we're probably used to keeping an eye on. And though that's where you should be looking for, what do I have to do under the law? You're looking state, county, municipal orders. So that's all I've got. I see one question in the chat. Yeah, so the question, so if an owner says, I don't want exempted people here, they can say that, but you as an employer, you can't apply that to your workforce. So that's something you need to mention to the owner. And I'll use a real drastic example. There are certain classes of people that you can't discriminate against based on certain traits. So you can't discriminate based on religion, gender, disabilities, things that we would all expect. So if an owner comes in and says, on this job site, I only want white Christian men, and I don't want any exemptions. That's the only people I want on my job site. If you as the employer go to your employees and staff it that way and say, well, the owner said they didn't want any exemptions from this policy, we're just following the rules, that's not an adequate excuse. So if the owner says, we don't want any exempted people, you can't follow that. You as an employer have to have accommodations if they're available. Now, there might not be accommodations, but you do need to go through the process. It's more complicated than it needs to be, but you can't just do things because the owner says. You need to do your own independent analysis of whether that's legal. In this example of an owner saying, we don't want exempted people, if you follow that, you could potentially be in trouble. So that's all I've got with that. I know we'll have questions and answers at the end. I'm happy to answer any that have come up so far, whether you want to speak up or type them in, happy to do that. Otherwise, I will turn this over to Brent.
Good morning. I just got a couple slides here. I wanted to keep this as simple as possible. We're talking about mandated vaccine requirements. In the last few weeks, I've been getting a few phone calls from contractors that are asking questions if it is an employer or an owner requirement for the vaccine, for employees to be on site with the vaccine on there. If they do have an incentive program or the employer has a program that they want to get their workers vaccinated, if there is a reaction to the vaccination, would that be considered a OSHA recordable? Back in May of 2021, OSHA and the Department of Labor came out and said that they will not consider that a recordable incident. So that is in effect until May of 2022, which you can see on the screen here. That may change with now the booster recommendation from the CDC and the government, federal government there. So that may be pushed out a little longer, but as of right now, until February of 2022, it's not a requirement for an OSHA recordable if there is a reaction to the vaccine on there. So, and again, that is on the OSHA website. It's black and white. I know there's been a few labor relations people out there telling their workers, no, it is a recordable, yeah, and things like that. It is not under the Department of Labor and OSHA on there. So on the next slide is some actual websites that you could go to get some information. I know I'm trying to keep this just on the vaccine requirement on there. So again, we have the Department of Health. Derek talked a little bit about that one. The CDC requirements, again, I tell every contractor, every safety person, CDC requirements are not law. It's just a recommendation. It's almost like if you're a safety person, you understand what the word should and shall means on there. Department of Labor and Health, or OSHA there. OSHA has a whole, I don't know, 10, 15 pages on COVID, so on there. And then the last one there, the COVID AGC of Wisconsin, we do have a website that actually has a bunch of information in there for if you are looking to put a plan together, or the flow chart. A lot of our contractors are using what we call the flow chart for potential confirmed exposures to COVID. That is, excuse me, just was updated yesterday. Mr. Felbel did a heck of a job updating it, and Derek worked on that yesterday to get that updated. So, so again, just trying to keep it simple, keeping it straight right to the vaccine side of it. If there is questions regarding mask mandates, other OSHA issues with COVID, please give Jim or myself or Derek a call, and we can answer those directly to, for your company and stuff like that. So that's all I had. Is there any questions? I know there's plenty for Derek.
Derek's that good. No questions.
I don't see anything in the chat.
Hey, Jeff, maybe just put up the contact information one more time so people can get a hold of, so know who to get a hold of.
Hey guys, I do have one question now that you guys mention it. Derek, you kind of glossed over it a little bit regarding the union contracts. Is there any discussion going on as far as reopening contracts or anything like that? When I'm not so concerned about a contractor, union contractor mandating their own people, but I'm more concerned about the owners and clients mandating that union people get it or they can't work there. There's something, I'm not all the way up on the union negotiations, but I'm just wondering if that's something that you guys are looking at.
We are, and I'd say what the lay of the land is, and this is general enough that I think it more or less applies across the board, is on one level, I think unions, like the rest of us, were hoping that as of this spring and summer, this would sort itself out. We'd get past COVID and move on to the next thing. So they have been a little hesitant to say 100%, yeah, you can vaccinate our workers, or no, you absolutely can't. Well, and we've been in constant contact with our other chapters, see how things are going across the nation. And what we've seen is when it's been owner mandated so far, the unions, and this applies to previous safety rules as well, they've kind of allowed that. They say, well, if the owner's requiring it, I guess we got to apply with that. We got to comply with that. I think there's a practical part of it where there's not enough owners requiring it right now that you can kind of move people around to get people that are willing to get vaccinated. You just put them on the vaccinated jobs, and then there's enough, work somewhere else that doesn't require vaccination. So that part's been going okay. Like you mentioned, there just haven't been many contractors that have said everyone here is getting it, regardless of whether an owner requires it or not. I think that's where there's just going to have to be more conversation. I don't have a solid answer for that, but on the owner mandated part, the unions have not had much of an issue complying with that, or they kind of understand where contractors are at. That could change, but that's where it's at so far. There hasn't been a lot of pushback if owners have mandated it. That could partially be because I think we're at a spot where a lot of the owners have said you need to have your people vaccinated by September or October. So the rubber hasn't hit the road yet. So that's kind of where it's at. I think if the owner's mandating it, you're in a lot better spot. If you're going to mandate it, stay tuned, I guess would be my response to that. But we're working on it. We're working on it. Everyone's kind of with this whole process has been just trying to do the right thing. I think the unions are, we are. So they're just ongoing conversations, because I think we all realize that we got to figure this out, just like, teacher unions have to figure it out with school districts, and on and on and on. So just, I would say stay tuned.
Derek,
Yeah,
it looks like we have a couple more questions in the chat feature.
Yeah, so yeah, the religious exemptions, and I was curious, I was poking around, what you can't just, if an employee all of a sudden just made up a religion and their only value or there's one commandment on the stone and it says you can't get vaccinated against COVID-19, you don't got to give that much leeway. As far as religious exemptions, there appears to be 2 religions that I could find that are pretty strict, not allowing vaccines. One are Christian Scientists, which is not Scientology, but Christian Scientists. they're very much against a lot of medical procedures. So that's one. It's a very small group of people. I think that's when I read there, it's less than 50,000 in the United States. My guess would be if you have an employee that's part of that, you probably had to make or perhaps had to have made an exemption before for certain things. And then the other one is the Dutch Reformed Church, which again is not the most common religion. So those are two that out and out have said we don't allow vaccines. It's probably combined in the whole US, less than 100,000 people. So it's very narrow. I'd be surprised if there's more than a couple working in construction in the state, probably less than 100 if I had to guess. So those are really the two. What someone can't say is, I'm Catholic and I don't want to get COVID-19. Well, the Catholic Church hasn't come out and said you can't get vaccinated. Actually, the opposite has happened. So if someone does fall under one of those religions that doesn't allow for vaccines, then you have to get an accommodation process that I mentioned before. And it's interactive. It's a back and forth. Okay, can we have this person mask up? Can we have them work when no one else is around? Can we, if they're an office worker, can they work exclusively from home rather than coming to the office? So you got to go through a process of all of that. If it's too difficult, then you don't have to accommodate it. If it's something reasonable that doesn't affect productivity too much, you do have to accommodate it. So the religious piece is going to be not apply to a ton of people, but if it does genuinely apply to them, then you got to go through this process of, is there some way to accommodate this person? Maybe yes, maybe no, but the process is important to go to as far as the law is concerned. Is a consent form required or some kind of records release? No, it's the EEOC, which governs employers in the United States, have said it's asking vaccination status, and only vaccination status does not require a consent form or anything like that. Where you want to be careful is you don't want to ask the why question at certain stages. So if you can ask someone, the forms that are well done say, check off if you're vaccinated or not, and do not provide any further information, because some of that further information, if you're not careful, can trigger confidentiality laws. So asking if someone is vaccinated, asking to maybe just see their card, not keep a copy of their card. You don't need a consent form. You don't need a records release. You're entitled to do that. If you're digging in deeper, if you're starting down this path of, is there a disability that they have? And I'm using the term disability, that's a legal term, but it covers a lot more than what we traditionally think of as a disability. For example, one of my lawsuits, a guy was, his snowblower got jammed up with snow, and he punched it out and it caught his glove, and it cut the very tip of his finger off. That's a disability. We probably wouldn't think of that as a disability in the normal course of our lives, but that is a disability under the ADA. So if you're inquiring about the specifics, then be careful, but just simply asking someone if they're vaccinated or not, you're free to do that. You're entitled to do that. No issues there as long as you're keeping it to that question.
And Derek, there was one other question initially in regards to wearing mask and adherence in the office.
Sure. So I'll use the Dane County one, which says you have the new one that came out a couple of days ago. It went into effect this morning. If you are in a public space, which is essentially defined as not your house and not outside. So even if you don't let people into your office off the street, that's still a public place. If you're in an enclosed space, door closed, like I am right now, you don't need to wear a mask. If you are in somewhere where other people are, and it's indoors and it's got 4 walls and a roof, you need to have a mask. So for example, if you're in the coal center and it's you and one other guy and he's 100 yards away, under the order, you should both have masks on. And that's kind of where it's at. That, and again, that's the Dane County one only. Other ones might be different. But if you're in an indoor space and your door's not closed and someone else is sharing it with you, at least in Dane County, you both should have masks on, regardless of vaccination status.
Yeah. And that also includes job sites that are indoors. That's a public area.
Correct. Yeah, I think of public doesn't mean open to the public. It means someone's there that you don't live with. That's how they define it as far as the Dane County orders, and most others are. That's the definition of public that they use.
It'll be interesting to watch Badger games this year.
They don't have to have masks on in the bowl, 'cause they're outside.
Just run the ball, run the ball, run the ball.
Jeff, do you have any other questions? I don't see anything.
I don't see anything. No.
Okay.
You guys can wrap it up.
Okay, that's all we've got. As we mentioned a couple times, reach out. I'm kind of a little bit sweaty here thinking about the stuff that had to hit the cutting room floor when you get into the nitty gritty of these. So to the extent you're making policies, have to make confronted with owner mandates, those sort of things, please reach out, because there's a lot we didn't cover with specifics. So again, don't hesitate. We're here to answer your questions and help out with those sort of things.
Hey, can I say one thing, guys? Thank you for allowing AGC of Greater Milwaukee to participate. We really appreciate it. This has been hitting us, especially in the medical field. So thank you again for allowing us to be involved. Appreciate it.
Jeff, I believe this is going to be posted onto the website, the AGC Wisconsin website, with probably by tomorrow.
Yeah, and we'll send it out. We'll have it posted on the website on our COVID-19 page, and then we'll also send it out to all participants. We'll send the recording and then the slides as well.
Good. All right, I guess that concludes this training session here. Again, if there's any questions or anything that pops up, please give Derek or myself or Mr. Felbo a phone call. We will help you out the best we can. Thank you.